A blue cat in a sweater, sitting on the curb outside a school, looking at a peanut girl whose voice is shaking and saying nothing while she tries to apologize for something she did not actually do. The street is empty. The sky behind them is the same flat watercolor blue. The show paints over every important moment. He is not yelling. He is not crying. He is making her feel small on purpose, and the camera holds on his face long enough that the audience understands the silence is the cruelty. That is Gumball Watterson at his worst. And the strange part is that the show knows it, and the stranger part is that it lets the moment land without rescuing him with a joke. Every long-running animated character has a worst version of themselves. The show let out into the world at some point. The amazing world of Gumball ran for 6 seasons, 240 episodes, across nearly a decade of Cartoon Network airtime. And across that span, it built a cast that the writers seemed to understand better than almost any other show on the network. That understanding came with a cost. To know a character that well is to know exactly where they break. And a show with the courage of Gumball was not afraid to push its characters into the rooms where they break. Looking at Gumball's worst versions is not about indicting the characters. It is about what the show was willing to admit about who they are when the laugh track lifts and the music stops and the camera simply waits. Welcome to Cartoon. Get comfortable. This one goes deep. Let us get into it. The least uncomfortable place to start is with a character whose worst version is the easiest to laugh at, because his worst is essentially his default with the volume turned up. Tobias Wilson, the rainbow-haired son of Harold and Jackie, the kid who spends most of the series convinced he is the protagonist of someone else's anecdote. Tobias is built around a single comic engine, which is the gap between how cool he believes he is and how cool he actually is. And most episodes use that gap for a quick laugh and then move on. There is one episode, however, where the show stops moving on. The episode is The Pressure, the 7th episode of the 2nd season, which aired in the United States on the 21st of November, 2012. And Tobias appears in it not as a side gag, but as something closer to a moral antagonist. The plot of The Pressure puts Gumball in the middle of a manufactured crisis. His friends have decided that he and Penny have been dating for too long without doing anything physical, and they corner him in the locker room to inform him that this is unacceptable. Tobias is the loudest voice in that room. He is not the only one applying the pressure, but he is the one who turns it into a sustained performance. He paces, he smirks, he invents stakes that do not exist, and then enforces them as if they were natural laws. The other boys nod along, but Tobias is the architect of the script Gumball is being handed. He tells Gumball what Penny will think if he does not act. He tells him what the school will think. He tells him what manhood is, in the voice of a child who has never been held accountable for anything in his life. What makes the scene difficult is not that Tobias is wrong about what teenage social pressure looks like. He is, in fact, accurate to a degree that is uncomfortable to sit with. He has absorbed the worst messages a young boy can absorb about romance, and is happily delivering them to a friend who clearly does not want to hear them. He frames the situation as a test of Gumball's identity. He frames Penny's affection as a thing that must be earned through escalation. And the show, crucially, does not give him a comeuppance. Tobias does not learn anything in The Pressure. He delivers his speech, sets the plot in motion, and exits the scene with his confidence intact, leaving Gumball to spend the rest of the episode trying to undo damage that Tobias never registers as damage. The behavioral read on Tobias here is that his worst version is not loud arrogance. His worst version is the version that has internalized a script he did not write and is enthusiastically passing it along, certain that he is helping. There is a particular kind of small cruelty in being the messenger of a culture you do not understand, and Tobias performs that cruelty with a smile. The reason he is the safest place to begin is that nothing he says lands lethally. Gumball survives the pressure. Penny survives it. The school year continues. But Tobias, in that one scene, becomes the avatar of every voice in a teenage boy's head that tells him love is a transaction and silence is failure. And the show lets him be that avatar without softening him afterward. The rainbow hair stays bright. The smile stays wide. He goes home to a house where everything has always been arranged for his comfort, and he sleeps well. A softer transition out of Tobias takes us to a character whose worst version is structurally similar to his, in that it is also a vanity that has been allowed to ferment for too long. But the vanity has been dressed in spiritual language, and that disguise makes it heavier. The school counselor at Elmore Junior High, Steve Small, the man whose office has a beanbag and a tambourine, and whose every line is delivered as if it might double as a poster in a teacher's lounge. Mr. Small is one of the show's most reliable comic engines because the show is always letting his sincerity slip. And behind the sincerity, there is something the show wants the audience to see, and that something is named in the episode The Stink. The Stink is the 11th episode of the 3rd season, which aired in the United States on the 7th of August, 2014. And it is a quietly devastating piece of writing that uses a literal smell as a metaphor for a moral one. The plot follows Hector, the giant child, who develops a body odor problem that begins to define his social life at school. Mr. Small leads the response. He delivers a long lecture about acceptance and inner beauty, and the importance of not judging others by their surface. He repeats variations of this lecture across the episode. He uses the words tolerance and compassion and community more times than any other character, and he positions himself, with the entire cast watching, as the moral center of the school. Then, Hector enters the room. The Hector who enters the room actually smells. His odor is not a metaphor. It is a sensory event, animated with green wisps, drawn into the air around him as a visible thing. And Mr. Small, the man who has spent the entire episode preaching tolerance, recoils. He covers his nose. He steps back. He looks at Hector with a face that is recognizably the face of a person who has just discovered that all of his previous statements were theoretical. It is a small physical moment, a few seconds at most, but the show gives those seconds full weight. The other characters in the scene see what Mr. Small does. The audience sees what Mr. Small does. Mr. Small himself, briefly, sees what Mr. Small has done, and then his face rearranges itself back into the shape of his beliefs, and he keeps preaching. That is the worst version of Mr. Small, not the recoil itself, which is a human response to a sensory assault. The worst version is the part where the recoil meets the lecture and the lecture wins, where the man chooses the comfort of his self-image over the work of actually examining what just happened. Mr. Small is, across the series, a character built on the gap between his stated ethics and his lived behavior, and The Stink is the episode where that gap stops being a joke and starts being a wound. The show is not contemptuous of him. It is patient with him. It lets him keep his job. It lets him keep his beanbag. But it shows the audience, with the precision of a documentary, that the man who spends his days telling children to accept others has not done the basic work of examining his own reflexes. The Stink is a small episode in the broader arc of the show. It is not one of the famous ones. There is no high concept setup, no fourth wall break, no animation gimmick. It is a quiet, observational piece about a teacher who is not as good a person as he believes himself to be. And the show trusts the audience to register that without underlining it. The reframe that the episode performs is simple and brutal. Tolerance is not a sermon. It is a reflex. And Mr. Small, when his reflex was tested, failed. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A natural next step takes us to a character whose worst version is not a hypocrisy, but a despair, and whose despair is shaped like a joke until it stops being one. Carrie Krueger, the ghost girl, daughter of an undead father and a mortal mother, the eternal teenager with the white hair and the closed eyes and the voice that always sounds slightly tired. Carrie is one of the show's most thoughtfully written supporting characters because she is, structurally, an immortal child being raised in a town where every other child is going to grow up and leave her. The show does not foreground that fact often. It lets the implication sit in the corner of the room and waits for the right episode to walk over and pick it up. The episode where it walks over is The Phone, the 3rd episode of the 3rd season, which aired in the United States on the 11th of June, 2014. The plot is one of the show's quieter ones. Nicole has finally gotten her family a smartphone, and the family becomes increasingly absorbed in it. And somewhere in the middle of that A plot, Carrie has a B plot that the episode tucks in like a footnote. She is at the school cafeteria. She is sitting alone. And in a brief but pointed sequence, she expresses something close to envy at the casual physicality of her classmates. The way they touch food, the way they bump into each other, the way they exist in space, in a way she structurally cannot. That is not yet her worst version. Her worst version comes in a different episode, one where the bitterness is allowed to surface fully. The episode is The Joy, the second episode of the third season, which aired in the United States on the 4th of June, 2014. And Carrie's role in it is small but precise. The Joy follows a contagious happiness virus that moves through the school, and Carrie is one of the characters who resists infection. Her resistance in the episode is portrayed comically. She is a goth ghost. She does not do happiness. The joke writes itself. But underneath the joke, the show is showing the audience a young person whose default emotional state is so guarded that even joy reads as a threat, and whose guardedness has hardened into something that is no longer protecting her, but isolating her. Her worst version is the version that watches a hallway full of her classmates being unironically delighted, and registers that delight as something to be opposed. There is a particular cruelty in the way she dismisses the joy of others. A cruelty that the show stages without comment. She does not say anything overtly mean. She does not need to. Her body language, her posture, the careful flatness of her voice, all communicate that she has decided, somewhere along the way, that the people around her are not allowed to feel things she does not feel. That is a small tyranny, and it is hers. The behavioral read on Carrie's worst version is that she has confused suffering with sophistication. She has built an identity around the idea that her detachment makes her see more clearly than her peers, and she has not noticed that the detachment is also a way of keeping herself safe from the embarrassment of caring. The show is enormously sympathetic to her. It gives her a love story with Darwin. It gives her a family arc. It treats her existential situation with real seriousness. But it also, in the moments where it lets her be at her worst, refuses to romanticize the pose. Detachment is not insight. Bitterness is not depth. A girl who cannot be happy because happiness would compromise her brand is still a girl in pain, and the pain does not become wisdom just because she stops smiling. What The Joy reveals about Carrie, and what later episodes confirm in smaller doses, is that her hardest work is not against the supernatural conditions of her existence, but against the version of herself that has built a wall and called the wall a personality. The show, late in its run, gives her moments of real warmth. Scenes where she lets the wall down with Darwin. Scenes where she is allowed to want things openly. Those scenes only register because the wall existed first. The worst version of Carrie is the architect of that wall, and the show was patient enough to draw her clearly so that her later softness would have a meaning. The next character extends the conversation about pose and pain into a body that cannot pose at all, because the body is too large. Hector Jotenheim, the giant kindergartner, the mountain that goes to school, the child who is somehow both 4 years old and 40 feet tall. Hector is one of the show's most quietly tragic figures, because every gag about his size carries a structural sadness that the show is never quite able to fully metabolize. He is too big for the world. He cannot hug his mother without crushing her. He cannot sit at a desk without breaking it. He cannot want anything strongly without endangering everyone in the room. The show plays this for laughs for many episodes, but the laughs are always shadowed by the implication that something terrible is going to happen the day he loses his composure. That day arrives in The Colossus, the 7th episode of the 3rd season, which aired in the United States on the 2nd of July, 2014, and the title is the show's quiet warning. The episode begins lightly. Hector is having a bad day at school, the kind of small frustrations that any kindergartner would experience, magnified through his scale, begin to accumulate. A misunderstanding with a classmate, a teacher who does not see him, a piece of equipment too small for his hands. The show lets these accumulate with a craftsman's patience. The audience is allowed to feel the pressure building inside him before he himself seems to register it. Then he loses control. What follows is one of the show's most genuinely frightening sequences. Hector becomes a giant. Not metaphorically. He grows. His scale shifts. He stops being the giant child and becomes the giant. He moves through Elmore as a force of nature, a thing that has slipped past every safety the town built around him. And the people he loves run from him because there is nothing else they can do. His mother, the witch, has spent her entire existence managing his size, has built her whole life around keeping him small enough to belong, and she watches him become the thing she always feared. The episode plays this with a rare and unsettling sincerity. There is no comic deflation. There are no jokes to let the air out. Hector is a monster, and the monster is a child, and the child is in agony. That is his worst version. Not the rampage itself, which is involuntary in the way an earthquake is involuntary. His worst version is the version that has been letting the pressure build for years, that has been quietly performing the role of the well-behaved giant while the thing inside him grew, that has been so committed to being the good son of a worried mother that he has refused to admit, even to himself, that he is suffering. The Colossus is the episode where the suppression fails, and the failure is catastrophic, and the catastrophe is everyone's fault, and no one's fault at the same time. The behavioral read on Hector here is that his worst version is the version that mistook compliance for kindness. He believed that if he could just be small enough, in spirit, to compensate for being so large in body, he would earn the right to exist among the people he loved. The show, with quiet clarity, shows the audience what that bargain costs. A child cannot grow into himself if every part of his growth is treated as a threat. The mother loves him. The mother is doing her best. The mother is also, structurally, raising him to believe that his power is a problem, and the day his power refuses to be a problem any longer, it becomes the worst version of itself by simply being itself without permission. What the Colossus reveals, and what Gumball at its best is willing to admit, is that some characters' worst versions are made by the world around them, long before the characters themselves act on them. Hector did not choose to be enormous. He did not choose to be raised on suppression. He inherited a body and a script, and the script told him that the body was the enemy. And one day, he believed the script too completely and became the enemy he had been told he was. The show is gentle with him. The episode ends with him calmed, returned to his school-shaped self, surrounded by people who still love him. But the audience has seen what he is when the lid comes off, and the audience cannot unsee it. And the show does not pretend that his return to small means his largeness is gone. The transition out of Hector takes us back inside the school, to a character whose worst version is not built from suppression, but from a long and uninterrupted entitlement to her own cruelty. Lucy Simian, the ancient ape, the teacher who has been teaching for so long that her contempt for her students has fossilized into a personality. Miss Simian is one of the show's most consistently written villains, in the small, grinding sense of villain. She is not an antagonist who wants to destroy the world. She is an antagonist who wants to make every Monday morning slightly worse for 30 children. And across the series, she succeeds at this with a discipline that is almost admirable. Her worst version, however, is not located in a single signature episode, the way some of the other characters are. Her worst version is distributed across the series like a slow leak, and to identify it, you have to point to a specific scene rather than a specific plot. The scene is in The Spoiler, the 11th episode of the 4th season, which aired in the United States on the 28th of July, 2015, and which puts Miss Simian in a position where her sadism is allowed to operate at full strength against children who have done nothing to deserve it. The plot of The Spoiler is light. Gumball and Darwin are trying to avoid having a movie spoiled for them, and the entire school becomes a hostile environment because spoilers are everywhere. Miss Simian's role in this is to weaponize the spoiler. She becomes one of the people threatening to ruin the movie for them, and what makes the scene reveal her worst version is the relish with which she does it. She is not protecting them from anything. She is not teaching them anything. She is using her position as a teacher, the position that gives her access to their attention, to inflict a small, recreational pain on children who have nowhere to go. The smile on her face as she does this is the smile of someone who has found a way to enjoy her work. Her worst version is the version that has stopped pretending that her job is about education and has started openly enjoying that her job is about power. The behavioral read on Miss Simian across the series is that she has been a teacher for so long that the students have ceased to be people in her mind. They are units. They are obstacles. They are sources of friction in a day she has otherwise designed for her own comfort. And the easiest way to manage that friction is to remind them regularly that they are powerless. The Spoiler is the episode where that reminder is delivered most nakedly, but she does versions of it in dozens of episodes. In line readings that are always slightly too pleased with themselves. In body language that is always slightly too relaxed for a person who is supposed to be working. The reframe that her worst version performs is uncomfortable for any viewer who has been a child in a classroom. Most teachers, in fiction and in life, are framed as people whose default state is care. Miss Simian is framed as a person whose default state is mild contempt. The show does not punish her for this. It does not give her a redemption arc. It does not even give her a particularly satisfying comeuppance episode. It simply lets her exist, episode after episode, as a working professional whose work has been corroded by the long indifference of her institution, and it lets the audience watch the corrosion happen in real time. The worst version of Miss Simian is not a flare of cruelty. It is the steady state of cruelty that an institution has rewarded for so long that it has become indistinguishable from competence. The next character changes the register entirely, because his cruelty is not knowing and not reflexive, but is instead a permission he has granted himself in the name of being seen. Tobias was vanity in motion. Mr. Small was vanity in disguise. Miss Simian was vanity in fossil form. Sarah G. Lato is vanity in the shape of fan love. And her worst version is one of the most pointed pieces of writing the show ever did about what it feels like to be on the receiving end of an audience. Sarah, the Donut Girl, the self-described #1 fan of Gumball and Darwin, the character who exists inside the show as a meta-commentary on the audience of the show. Her arc across the series is short but focused. She begins as a minor background presence, becomes a recurring fan figure, and eventually takes over an entire plot in the episode that the show built around her, which is The Shippening, the 31st episode of the 5th season, which aired in the United States on the 31st of October, 2017. The Shippening is, on its surface, a Halloween episode. Underneath, it is a quiet horror story about what happens when a fan stops being a fan and starts being an author. The plot of The Shippening puts Sarah in possession of a magical pen that allows her to rewrite reality to match her fanfiction. She begins to ship characters in the school. She forces couples together. She forces couples apart. She rewrites the lives of her classmates to fit the romantic plots she has been imagining in her bedroom. The episode is funny in the way the show is usually funny, but underneath the comedy, there is a genuinely uncomfortable portrait of what fan love becomes when it stops being love and becomes ownership. Sarah does not see the people she is rewriting. She sees the characters she has projected onto them, and she treats those characters as property. Her worst version, in The Shippening, is not the rewriting itself. The rewriting is a magical premise. Her worst version is what she does with the rewriting, which is that she uses it to override the consent of every person in the school in service of a narrative that exists only in her head. She is not, in her own mind, doing anything wrong. She is, in fact, certain that she is doing something good. She is making the story better. She is fixing the plot. She is providing, for the world, the shape of romance that the world has failed to provide on its own. The show watches her with the patience of a writer who has clearly been on the other side of fan attention, and it lets her be wrong with a precision that is almost loving. The behavioral read on Sarah is that her worst version is the version that has stopped being able to distinguish between affection and authorship. She loves her classmates in the way that a fan loves the characters of a show. She has thought about them constantly. She has written about them. She has cared about their happiness with a fervor that no one in their lives can match. And that love, when it is given the power to act, becomes an erasure. The people she loves cease to be people. They become drafts of the people she wishes they would be, and she edits them with a confidence that no real love would ever earn. The Shippening ends, as the show's metafictional episodes usually end, with the pen taken away and the world mostly restored. But the residue of what Sarah did remains. The audience has seen her at her worst, and her worst is not malice. Her worst is enthusiasm. There is something difficult for any audience watching about being asked to consider that the version of fandom that loves a story most is also, structurally, the version most capable of harming the story by trying to take it over. The show does not lecture about this. It shows it. It puts the Donut Girl in the middle of her own dream and lets her find out, slowly, that the dream was not as kind as she thought it was. And then it gives her the donut shape back and lets her go home, a fan again, slightly humbler, but only slightly. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next character is structurally smaller in the show than Sarah, but exists in a position of authority that makes his worst version more institutionally consequential. Nigel Brown, the strawberry-shaped principal of Elmore Junior High, the man whose every decision affects hundreds of children, but who has been written, across the series, as a person who is never quite present enough to make those decisions seriously. Principal Brown is one of the show's most thoughtfully comedic figures, because he is a portrait of leadership without leadership, of a role that is being filled but not occupied. He shows up for the meetings. He delivers the speeches. He is not, in any real sense, in charge of anything. His worst version is on display in The Box, the 23rd episode of the 5th season, which aired in the United States on the 8th of August, 2017. An episode that puts him in a position to do his actual job and watches what happens when he tries. The plot is one of the show's classic chase plots. A mysterious box arrives at the school. Various characters try to figure out what is in it. Principal Brown, in his role as the head of the institution, is asked to make decisions about how the school should respond to the box. And he does what he always does, which is to outsource the decision to anyone else within reach, then take credit for whichever outcome happens to occur. His worst version, in The Box, is not the cowardice of the outsourcing. The cowardice of the outsourcing is the standard version. His worst version is the calmness with which he later assumes credit for an outcome he did nothing to produce, and the equally calm willingness with which he would have assumed blame, had blame been the politically advantageous response. He is not interested in the outcome. He is interested in being the principal, which is a different thing from being a leader. And across the episode, the show draws this distinction with a precision that is almost academic. The behavioral read on Principal Brown is that his worst version is the version that has fully accepted that his job is performative. He is the principal. The principal does principal things. The principal things include speeches and announcements and meetings and the occasional ceremonial appearance at a sports event. And they do not include the actual work of deciding what the institution should do, because the institution has not, in his understanding, ever asked him to decide that. The Box is the episode where this default becomes a structural failure. Children are in the building with an unknown object. Adults are looking to him for direction. He provides nothing. He provides the appearance of direction, which is a worse thing than providing nothing, because it absorbs the energy that other adults could have used to act. What The Box reveals about Principal Brown is something the show seems to want to say about institutions in general. A position of authority, when it is occupied by a person who has decided that the position is more important than the responsibility, becomes a vacuum that absorbs the agency of everyone around it. The children at Elmore Junior High are unsafe, not because Principal Brown is malicious, but because Principal Brown is absent in a way that requires constant active maintenance. He has built around himself an architecture of plausible deniability so complete that the institution has organized itself around the fact of his abdication. That is his worst version. Not a single bad decision. The systemic refusal to make decisions at all, performed with such consistency that everyone has stopped expecting him to. The transition out of Principal Brown takes us to a character whose worst version returns the conversation to the question of what happens when softness is asked to do work it cannot do. Penny Fitzgerald, the antlered peanut, the captain of the cheer squad, the eventual girlfriend of Gumball Watterson, the character whose entire arc is shaped by the question of what is allowed to come out from under a shell. Penny is one of the show's most carefully built characters because she has, across the series, the longest internal journey from concealment to expression, and the journey is rewarded by the show with one of its most genuinely moving episodes, which is The Shell, the 3rd episode of the 4th season, which aired in the United States on the 23rd of June, 2015. But The Shell is not where Penny is at her worst. The Shell is where Penny is at her bravest. To find her worst version, you have to look at the episodes that come after, the ones where the freedom of being out from under the shell sometimes curdles into a kind of certainty about how she should be treated, and where that certainty occasionally becomes a small edge in her relationships with the people who knew her before. The episode that surfaces this most clearly is The Pony, the 23rd episode of the 3rd season, which aired in the United States on the 25th of February, 2015. And although The Pony is structurally Anais's episode, Penny's role in it shows a small, worst version of herself that is worth lingering on. In The Pony, Penny is part of the social environment in which Anais's secret love of the children's pony show is exposed and mocked. She is not the cruelest voice in that environment. She is not the loudest. But she is part of the chorus, and her participation matters because the show has already established that she is supposed to be one of the kindest characters in the cast. Her willingness, in the moment, to laugh along with the mockery, to not step in, to not extend to Anais the same patience that she would expect to be extended to her, is a quiet failure of moral consistency. The show does not punish her for it. It barely acknowledges it, but the moment is there, and the moment is a worst version, because it shows that even kindness, when it is asked to be brave in public, can sometimes choose the easier silence. A more pointed worst version of Penny appears in some of the later episodes, where she has fully transitioned into her shape-shifting form and is dating Gumball openly. There are scenes, particularly in episodes like The Best, the 22nd episode of the 5th season, which aired in the United States on the 20th of July, 2017, where Penny's competitive impulse, the same impulse that made her a cheer captain, is allowed to surface in a way that crosses into a small cruelty toward Gumball. She wants him to be the best. She wants this for him. She also, when his bestness fails to materialize, has a hardness in her response that the show does not soften. She is disappointed in him. She is, briefly, contemptuous of him. The contempt does not last, but it exists, and the show, in its later seasons, seems increasingly willing to let it exist. The behavioral read on Penny's worst version is that her years under the shell were not only years of fear. They were also years of accumulated frustration at a world that asked her to be smaller than she was. And when the shell came off, the frustration came off too, and it has not all been resolved. She is, structurally, a person who spent the first half of her childhood performing a smaller version of herself, and the second half learning that she is allowed to want more, the wanting more, when it meets a partner who is sometimes incapable of providing more, becomes a friction that the show is honest enough to depict. She loves Gumball. She also sometimes looks at him the way a person looks at a project that is not going well. What Penny's worst version reveals is that softness and kindness are not the same thing. A character can be soft, in the sense of being gentle and kind in 1,000 small interactions, and still have edges that emerge when the softness is asked to absorb more than it can absorb. The show is unusually patient with this in Penny. It does not turn her into a villain. It does not even particularly mark her bad moments as bad. It simply lets them exist, lets them be witnessed, and trusts the audience to register that the captain of the cheer squad, the girl who was once trapped in an antlered shell, is also, sometimes, a person whose disappointment can be heavy to be on the receiving end of. The transition into the family begins with Anais, the 4-year-old genius, the youngest Watterson, the rabbit child whose intelligence has made her, by the design of her household, the de facto adult in a family that has no other adults available. Anais is one of the show's most quietly loaded characters because her structural position is impossible. She is a small child in the body of a small child, with the cognitive abilities of an adult, in a house where the adults behave like small children, and she has been doing the work of holding the family together, in small ways, for as long as she has been able to talk. That work has consequences, and the consequences have a worst version, and the worst version has an episode. The episode is The Pony, again, the same episode that surfaced Penny's worst version. But Anais is its protagonist, and her arc inside it is the heaviest single arc of her character across the series. The premise is that Anais has a private love of a children's show called Daisy the Donkey. The love is age appropriate. She is 4. The show is built for 4-year-olds, but she has decided, somewhere along the way, that the love is shameful, that she is supposed to be too smart for it, that being seen loving it would cost her the identity she has built around being the family's secret intelligence. So she hides the love. She hides it with the precision of an adult hiding an addiction. Then her secret is exposed. The exposure happens at school, in front of her classmates and her brothers. And Anais's response is the worst version of her. She does not own the love. She does not defend it. She turns on the show she loves. She mocks it, loudly, in the voice of someone trying to distance herself from a friend in the moment of greatest social danger. She joins the chorus that is laughing at the thing she most cherishes. The show stages this with a particular kind of patience. It does not move quickly past her betrayal. It lets the audience see her face as she does it. It lets the audience see, in the same shot, the recognition that she has just sold something out, and the calculation that she has decided the sale is worth it. That is her worst version. Not the love itself, which is innocent. Not even the hiding of the love, which is sad, but understandable. Her worst version is the moment of public denial. The moment where she chose her image over her honesty, and where she did so with the precision of a person who has been managing her image for so long that the management has become reflexive. Anais has been performing competence sense for her entire short life. The Pony is the episode where the performance metastasizes into a small but real cruelty against herself, and against the thing she loves, and against the show that gave her the thing she loved in the first place. The behavioral read on Anais's worst version is that she has been forced by the structure of her family to grow up too quickly, and that growing up too quickly has cost her the right to be a child in any visible way. Her brothers can be ridiculous. Her father can be ridiculous. Her mother can be ridiculous on the rare occasions she allows herself to. Anais cannot. Anais is the one who has to be reasonable, who has to be sharp, who has to be the one in the room who knows what is happening. And the cost of that role across the years is that the small and tender parts of her, the parts that love a children's pony show, have been driven into hiding so deep that when they are dragged into the light, she does not recognize them as hers, and she rejects them in public to save herself. The pony does not fully redeem her. The episode ends with a softening, with a tentative reconnection to the love, with the suggestion that she will be allowed to keep both her intelligence and her tenderness. But the moment of betrayal is not erased. The show does not pretend that her cruelty did not happen. It simply moves forward, the way the family moves forward, the way every family moves forward after a small, unspeakable betrayal, by deciding not to speak of it. Anais learns at 4 years old that the price of being the smart one is sometimes the willingness to lie about who she loves. And the show, with quiet seriousness, lets her learn that lesson and lets her carry it with her into every episode that follows. What the pony reveals, beyond Anais herself, is something the show seems to want to say about precocity in general. A child who is forced to be an adult does not simply become an adult early. They become a child who has been hollowed out and refilled with adult-shaped responsibilities. And the original child, the 4-year-old who loves a pony, gets pushed into the smallest available room inside the new structure and is rarely let out. Anais's worst version is the version of her that has accepted the trade. Her best version, in the rare episodes where she is allowed to play, is the version that briefly remembers the trade was not worth it. The transition into Darwin extends the conversation about how children manage themselves under the pressure of inherited family roles. But Darwin's role is different from Anais's, and so his worst version is shaped differently. Darwin Watterson, the orange goldfish who grew legs and joined the family, the adopted brother whose entire existence in the household is structured around gratitude. He is the one who chose to be there. He is the one whose presence is, in some technical sense, a favor the family did him. And that gratitude, across the series, becomes one of his most defining traits. And the trait has a shadow side, and the shadow side has an episode. The episode is The Vegging, the 28th episode of the 5th season, which aired in the United States on the 24th of August, 2017. And it is one of the show's most genuinely uncomfortable Darwin episodes, because it shows the audience what happens when the brother, who is always supposed to be the kind one, decides that he has had enough. The plot is a slow build. Darwin, after years of being the supportive presence, the agreeable voice, the moral compass of the sibling pair, decides to spend a weekend doing nothing. He vegs. He sinks into the couch. He stops responding to requests. He stops being available to the family that has, in his mind, been using his availability for its entire existence. The vegging itself is not his worst version. The vegging is, in a way, healthy. A character who has been over-functioning for years, deciding to do nothing for a weekend, is not a moral failing. His worst version is what comes out of him as the vegging deepens. Because the deeper he sinks, the more honest he becomes. And the honesty is acidic. He starts saying things to Gumball that he has clearly been thinking for years. He starts naming small resentments. He starts pointing at the gap between what he does for the family and what the family does for him. And the pointing has a sharpness that the show has never let him have before. The behavioral read on Darwin's worst version in The Vegging is that he has been a person all along, and the role of the agreeable brother has been costing him more than the family ever noticed. He is not a saint. He is a child who was adopted into a household and who decided very early that the safest way to remain in that household was to be useful. And the usefulness has been, for years, the price of his belonging. The Vegging is the episode where he stops paying the price for a weekend, and the family, faced with a Darwin who is not paying, does not know what to do. Gumball is offended. Nicole is concerned. Richard is mostly oblivious, but in the moments where he registers it, he is hurt. What makes the vegging difficult is that the show does not give Darwin a clean redemption. He does not, at the end of the episode, snap back into the agreeable brother and apologize for his honesty. The honesty stays. The vegging eventually ends, but the things he said do not unsay themselves. And the family, by the end of the episode, has been informed of certain things about themselves that Darwin will, for the rest of the series, occasionally reference. The show does not make a big deal of the change. It is not announced. It is not foregrounded. It is simply present in the small ways that Darwin is, after the vegging, a character with a slightly harder edge than he had before. His worst version, then, is not the laziness. The laziness is a symptom. His worst version is the version that has been quietly keeping score for years, that has been measuring the gap between his contribution and the family's reciprocity, and that has decided, at some point, that the gap is not going to close on its own. The vegging is the episode where the score becomes audible, and the audibility has the texture of a small collapse. The brother who is always supposed to be there, in the way that Darwin is always supposed to be there, has admitted that the always being there has been a job he never agreed to take. There is a second Darwin episode that surfaces a different worst version, and it is worth pairing with the vegging because the two together describe a fuller portrait. The episode is The Founder, the 29th episode of the 5th season, which aired in the United States on the 28th of August, 2017, in which Darwin discovers something about his origins that destabilizes his sense of who he is. His response, in The Founder, is to become someone else. He attempts to perform a different identity, a more refined and elevated version of himself, and the performance becomes, briefly, a kind of contempt for the family that raised him. He is embarrassed by them. He is, for a few scenes, openly above them. The show stages this with the particular sadness of a parent watching a child go through a phase that the parent recognizes as a phase, but that hurts anyway. Darwin's worst version, in The Founder, is the version that briefly believes he is too good for the people who chose him. The show does not let him stay there. The episode pulls him back, returns him to the family, restores the warmth. But the residue of the contempt remains, and the audience has seen it. And the audience knows now that even Darwin, the gentlest of the children, has a place inside him where the gentleness becomes a stone he can throw. Across the vegging and The Founder, the show describes a Darwin who is not the saint the early seasons made him out to be, who has resentments, who has aspirations, who has, in his small fish body, the same potential for cruelty that lives in any thinking creature. The worst version of him is the version that has admitted these things to himself and is briefly willing to act on them. The best version of him is the version that, having admitted them, decides to stay anyway. The transition into Richard requires a careful adjustment of tone, because Richard's worst version is structurally different from any of the worst versions discussed so far. The other characters' worst versions are flares, moments where the standard self breaks and a sharper self briefly surfaces. Richard's worst version is closer to a default. He is a character whose entire structure is built around an abdication, and the abdication has consequences, and the consequences are visible in many episodes. And to identify a single worst version is therefore less about finding a flare, and more about finding the episode where the abdication does the most damage. Richard Watterson, the Pink Rabbit, the unemployed husband, the biological father of 3 children whom he loves and consistently fails. He is one of the show's most genuinely difficult characters because he is written with such warmth that the audience is repeatedly tricked into forgetting how much harm he does. He is funny. He is loving in his way. He is incapable of holding a job, incapable of handling a household responsibility, incapable of being a reliable presence in the lives of the people who depend on him, and the show, with extraordinary patience, depicts all of this without ever quite naming it as the indictment it is. His worst version is on display in The Job, the 22nd episode of the 2nd season, which aired in the United States on the 24th of January, 2013. An episode that the show built with a kind of cosmic horror logic around the idea of what would happen if Richard ever got a real job. The premise is that Richard is hired by a delivery company. He becomes a pizza delivery man. He performs the job with surprising competence. The competence has unintended consequences. The consequences accumulate. By the end of the episode, the entire economy of Elmore is in collapse, and the collapse is causally traceable to Richard's brief excursion into employment. The episode is structurally a comedy. It is one of the show's most creative pieces of escalation. But underneath the comedy, there is something the show seems to be saying about Richard, and the something is brutal. The reason Richard cannot work is not that he lacks the capacity. He has the capacity. The episode demonstrates this. The reason Richard cannot work is that the universe has, in some way, made a deal with Richard's incompetence. And the deal is that the world will continue to function as long as Richard does not try. The moment he tries, the world breaks. So Richard, in some unspoken understanding with reality, agrees not to try. That is his worst version. Not the failure to provide, which is its own thing, but the agreement with the failure. Richard, across the series, has accepted the framing that he is incapable. He has built his entire identity around the framing. The framing relieves him of every responsibility he would otherwise have to face. He cannot get a job, so he does not have to look for one. He cannot help the children with their homework, so he does not have to learn the material. He cannot do the dishes, so he does not have to do the dishes. The framing is so total, so airtight, that the moment in the job when it briefly cracks, when Richard is for a few minutes a competent worker, the world's response is to immediately collapse so that the framing can be restored. Nicole, his wife, is the one who pays the cost of the framing. The children pay the cost of the framing. The show, in episode after episode, depicts the cost with a precision that should be unbearable, but that is somehow softened by the writing into a series of small, recurring tragedies. Nicole works 2 jobs. Nicole does the housework. Nicole carries the emotional load of the family. Richard naps on the couch. Richard eats. Richard occasionally does something that the show frames as endearing, and the frame works on the audience because Richard is sweet and earnest and clearly loves his family. But the love does not translate into action, and the absence of action accumulates, and the accumulation has a worst version, and the worst version is the job. The episode where the show admits, in the only way it knows how to admit anything serious, that Richard's incapability is a choice. The behavioral read on Richard, and on his worst version specifically, is that he has confused dependence with love. He believes, in some inarticulate way, that being loved means being taken care of, and that being a good husband and father means being lovable enough to deserve care. He has not done the harder work of understanding that love, in a household with children, has a labor component, and that the labor cannot be performed by the children, and that if the labor falls entirely on one parent, the other parent has, in some structural sense, become a 4th child rather than a partner. Richard does not see this. The show, in its kindest moments, suggests that he is incapable of seeing it. In its harder moments, the show suggests that he has chosen not to see it because the seeing would cost him too much. The Job is the episode where the show puts the choice on screen. Richard demonstrates competence. The world demonstrates that competence is possible. Richard then returns, by the end of the episode, to incompetence, and the world rewards the return with its restored equilibrium. The lesson, if there is a lesson, is one that the show declines to spell out. It simply shows the audience that Richard, when he stops trying, is rewarded, and that the reward is structured in a way that ensures he will never try again, and that his family will continue to carry the weight of his not trying for the foreseeable future. There is a second Richard episode that deepens the portrait, and it is worth naming because it adds a specific element of moral weight to the worst version. The episode is The Authority, the 20th episode of the 3rd season, which aired in the United States on the 11th of February, 2015, and it places Richard in the only role the show has ever allowed him to play with full force, which is the role of the angry father. In The Authority, Nicole has been told to assert more authority over the children, and Richard, watching her, decides that he has been failing as a disciplinarian, and he attempts to become one. He attempts to discipline. He attempts to enforce. He attempts to be the heavy. His worst version, in The Authority, is the version that uses his newfound disciplinary authority to indulge the same selfishness that has always defined him. He does not become a stricter father in any way that benefits the children. He becomes a stricter father in the ways that benefit himself. He uses authority to get out of chores he never did anyway. He uses it to claim the best food. He uses it to win arguments by force that he has previously lost by reason. The show plays this for laughs, but the laughs have a residue because the audience has seen, in Richard's brief experiment with authority, exactly what kind of authority he would have wielded all along if he had been wielding any. That is the deeper worst version, not the abdication, but the glimpse of what the abdication has been hiding. Richard has not been a kind man who simply lacks the capacity to be a strong father. He has been, in some quiet way, a man who has been allowed by his wife and his children to never have to demonstrate what kind of strong father he would actually be, because the demonstration would not be flattering. The Authority is the episode where the demonstration accidentally happens, and what the audience sees is a man whose strength, when summoned, immediately serves himself. The show pulls back. The episode ends with the standard Richard restored, but the residue is there, and the audience knows, and the show knows that the audience knows. What Richard's worst version reveals, taken across The Job and The Authority, is that the abdication has been a kind of moral choice all along. He has not been incapable. He has been unwilling, and the unwillingness has been so consistent, so foundational, that it has shaped the entire structure of his family. Nicole's exhaustion is downstream of his unwillingness. Anais's premature adulthood is downstream of his unwillingness. Gumball's chaos is downstream of his unwillingness. Darwin's overfunctioning is downstream of his unwillingness. The show is patient with him. The show loves him. The show also, when it is honest, shows the audience the cost. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The transition into Nicole requires the audience to understand that her worst version is, in some deep way, a downstream effect of Richard's worst version, and that the show is honest enough to depict the relationship without flattening either character. Nicole Watterson, the blue cat, the working mother, the only adult in a household of children, the woman whose every episode is a quiet study in how much one person can carry before the carrying breaks the carrier. Nicole is one of the most extensively developed characters in the show, and her worst version is therefore harder to locate, because the writers have given her so many bad days that ranking them feels almost unfair. But there is one episode that surfaces her worst version more cleanly than the others, and that episode is The Choices, the 7th episode of the 5th season, which aired in the United States on the 26th of August, 2016. The Choices is structurally a memory piece. The framing device is that Nicole, on a difficult evening, is reflecting on the choices that brought her to the life she now has. The episode flashes back to her past. It shows her as a young woman with options. It shows her meeting Richard. It shows her choosing him. It shows her choosing the family. And it shows, in a single understated sequence near the end, that the woman she would have been without these choices is also, in some way, a person who exists inside her, and who occasionally surfaces, and whose surfacing the present-day Nicole has to manage like a secret. That is not yet her worst version. The Choices is, on its surface, a tender episode. It is the contextual document for understanding her worst version. To find the worst version itself, you have to look at the episodes where the person she would have been breaks through into the person she actually is, and the breakthrough has consequences. The episode where this happens with the most violence is The Stress, the 8th episode of the 5th season, which aired in the United States on the 2nd of September, 2016, and which puts Nicole in a position where the entire structure of her self-containment fails in real time. The plot of The Stress is simple. Nicole is having a bad week. The bad week is structural rather than incidental. Work has been demanding. The family has been demanding. The world has been demanding. She has been performing the role of the competent center of her household, and the performance has been costing her. And the cost has accumulated until the accumulation is no longer manageable. Then, in the middle of an ordinary day, something small breaks, and the small break opens a larger break, and the larger break opens a chasm, and Nicole loses control. The losing of control in The Stress is animated as a literal, physical phenomenon. Nicole transforms. Her body changes. Her color shifts. Her eyes changes shape. She becomes a version of herself that is recognizable and terrifying. A Nicole who has stopped containing the rage that the standard Nicole has been containing for years. And the rage is not aimed at anyone specifically, because the rage is not really about anyone specifically. The rage is about the years. The rage is about the carrying. The rage is about the fact that she has been the only adult in the room for so long that the room has stopped noticing she is the adult, and she has stopped being able to perform the role without something inside her demanding, audibly, that the performance stop. That is her worst version. Not the rage itself, which is the byproduct of conditions she did not choose. Her worst version is what the rage does to the people in front of her, who are her children, and who do not deserve to be the recipients of the rage, even though they are, in some structural sense, beneficiaries of the conditions that produced it. Nicole, in The Stress, frightens her children. She does not hurt them. She does not, in the episode itself, do anything physically destructive, but she frightens them. And the show holds on their faces as she does it. And the audience sees what it is to be a child in a house where the parent who has been holding everything together has just for a moment, stopped holding. The behavioral read on Nicole's worst version is that her control has always been, in some sense, a wall against her own depths, and the wall has been load-bearing for the entire family. She has had to be calm so that no one else would have to be. She has had to be reasonable so that no one else would have to be. She has had to be the parent so that no one else would have to be. And the cumulative cost of being the only one has produced, inside her, a pressure that the show has been hinting at for many episodes before the stress finally lets it out. When it comes out as a transformation, because the show does not have any other visual language for what is happening to her. She is not Nicole anymore. She is the thing Nicole has been keeping inside. What makes The Stress one of the show's most adult pieces of writing is that it does not let her off the hook for the transformation. The show is sympathetic. The show explains the conditions. The show clearly understands that Nicole is not a villain, but the children are also not the cause. And the children also do not deserve to be the audience for what the conditions have produced. And the show, with quiet honesty, lets the audience watch Nicole frighten her own children and lets the audience sit with what that means. There is no tidy resolution. There is no apology that erases the moment. The episode ends with the family slightly more aware of what their mother has been carrying, and slightly more afraid of what happens when she is asked to carry it for one more day, and Nicole herself slightly more aware that the wall she has been maintaining is not as load-bearing as she had hoped. There is a second Nicole episode that pairs with The Stress to deepen the portrait, and it is worth naming because it surfaces a different facet of her worst version. The episode is The Mothers, the 18th episode of the 5th season, which aired in the United States on the 23rd of June, 2017, and it places Nicole in direct emotional contact with her own mother, Mary Cinecourt, after years of estrangement. The episode is built around the question of whether Nicole can forgive her mother, but underneath it is a different question, which is whether Nicole has, in becoming the parent she became, simply continued the patterns that she swore she would break. Her worst version, in The Mothers, is the version that briefly considers the possibility that her mother was right. There is a sequence in the episode where Nicole, faced with the disappointments of her own family, looks at the discipline of her mother's house and registers, for a moment, an envy. The envy does not become action. Nicole does not become her mother. But the envy is there, and the show stages it without comment. And the audience is allowed to see that the woman who has been protecting her children from the harshness of her own upbringing has, somewhere inside her, a small voice that wonders whether the harshness might have been more efficient. That is the second worst version. Not the harshness itself, but the wondering. Nicole has been working for her entire adult life to be a different kind of mother than the one she had. The work has been hard. The work has not always been rewarded. And in the moments where the work feels most thankless, the small voice asks whether the alternative would have been better. And the alternative is the mother who broke her. And the entertaining of the alternative, even in the form of a brief envy, is a betrayal of every choice she has made. The show does not punish her for the betrayal. It simply lets her have the thought, lets her recognize the thought, and lets her, by the end of the episode, choose again to not act on it. But the thought has been spoken. The audience has heard it, and the audience knows now that even Nicole, the most disciplined character in the show, has a place inside her where the discipline frays. What Nicole's worst version reveals, taken across The Stress and The Mothers, is that her competent tense has been a daily achievement rather than a default state. She has been choosing, every morning, to be the mother her children needed, rather than the mother her exhaustion or her inheritance might have made her. The choice has cost her something, and the cost has accumulated. And there are episodes where the cost is briefly visible, and those episodes are her worst versions, because they are the moments where the cost briefly outweighs the choice. The show does not judge her for them. The show, in its deepest writing, suggests that the moments are unavoidable, that no person can carry what Nicole carries without occasionally dropping it, and that the measure of her is not the absence of bad moments, but the consistency with which she returns, after each one, to the work. The transition into Gumball brings the conversation to its hardest single subject, because Gumball, more than any other character in the show, has been written across his entire arc as a person whose worst version is closer to the surface than his standard version would suggest. He is the protagonist. He is funny. He is, on most days, the engine of the show's comedy. He is also, in specific episodes, a person who is capable of cruelty in ways that the show has been remarkably honest about depicting. To identify his single worst version is to choose between several episodes where the show, deliberately and with full intention, lets him be small. The episode that surfaces his worst version most cleanly is The Apology, the 22nd episode of the 5th season, which aired in the United States on the 22nd of July, 2017, and which places Gumball in a position where he has done something wrong and is being asked by the social structure of the school to apologize. The premise is that Gumball, in some prior incident, has wronged Miss Simian. The wrong is not, in itself, exceptional. He has done some small thing. The school requires him to apologize. The show's question, across the episode, is whether he can. The answer, for most of the episode, is no. Gumball cannot apologize. He cannot do it. He stands in front of Miss Simian. He opens his mouth. Nothing comes out. He attempts a different angle. He attempts a different room. He attempts a different time of day. The apology refuses to leave his body. The show stages this with a kind of comic patience that becomes, as the episode progresses, less comic and more diagnostic. The audience begins to understand, slowly, that Gumball's inability to apologize is not a quirk. It is a structural feature of who he is, and the structural feature has implications, and the implications are not flattering. His worst version, in The Apology, is the version that has so completely organized himself around the avoidance of accountability that the avoidance has become a moral identity. He cannot apologize because apologizing would require admitting that he was wrong, and admitting that he was wrong would require revising his self-image. And his self-image is the only thing keeping him operational in a world that has otherwise demanded too much of him. So he does not apologize. He delays. He deflects. He invents reasons why the apology is not, technically, owed. He performs, in the place of an apology, an entire repertoire of behaviors that look like sincerity, but that do not, at any point, contain the word sorry. The behavioral read on Gumball's worst version in The Apology is that he has been, for a long time, a person who has confused being liked with being good. He believes, in some inarticulate way, that as long as the people around him continue to find him entertaining, the question of whether he is also kind does not arise. The episode tests this belief. Miss Simian is not asking for entertainment. She is asking for an apology, which is a specific moral action. And Gumball discovers, with what looks like genuine surprise, that he does not have the equipment to perform the action. The equipment was never built. The equipment was, in fact, replaced, somewhere along the way, by an elaborate compensatory architecture of charm. And the charm, when faced with the demand for the apology, breaks. That is the worst version. Not a single mean line. Not a single loud cruelty. A structural inability to face the basic moral demand of admitting fault, dressed up as a comic plot, depicted with such precision that the audience, by the end of the episode, has been forced to consider that the protagonist of the show they have been watching is, in this specific way, broken. The show does not punish him for it. The episode ends with a workaround, a performance of an apology that is technically delivered, but that does not contain the substance of the thing. Miss Simian accepts the workaround. The school moves on. Gumball goes home, and the audience knows that he has not learned anything, and the show, with quiet honesty, declines to pretend otherwise. There is a companion episode that pairs with The Apology to deepen the portrait of Gumball's worst version, and it is one of the show's most genuinely difficult half hours. The episode is The Pressure, the same episode that introduced Tobias's worst version, but Gumball's role in it surfaces a different worst version of his own, and that worst version is one of the cruelest things he ever does to another character. The Pressure, in its second act, places Gumball in a situation where he has been told by his friends to physically escalate his relationship with Penny, and he, faced with the pressure, decides to act on the script he has been handed. He goes to Penny. He attempts to perform the script. He does not, in the moment, recognize that the script is wrong. He does not, in the moment, recognize that Penny is not asking for the script. He sees only the social pressure, the friends watching, the stakes that have been invented for him by Tobias and the others, and he attempts to do what the script tells him to do, and Penny is the recipient of the attempt. The show stages the scene with a particular kind of restraint. There is no leering. There is no glorification. The scene is uncomfortable to watch, and it is uncomfortable in a way that the show clearly wants the audience to feel. His worst version, in The Pressure, is the version that prioritizes the pressure of his peers over the dignity of the person he claims to love. He is not, in the scene, malicious. He is, in some sense, simply weak. But the weakness has a victim, and the victim is Penny, and the show is honest enough to depict her discomfort without softening it. She is confused. She is hurt. She is, briefly, afraid, in the way that any child can be afraid when the social script being performed on them is one they did not consent to. Gumball, by the end of the scene, recognizes what he has done. He pulls back. He apologizes, in his way. The episode resolves into a quieter, more honest moment between them. But the audience has seen what he was willing to do, and the show does not pretend they have not. A third episode that surfaces Gumball's worst version is The Society, the 17th episode of the 5th season, which aired in the United States on the 2nd of June, 2017. An episode in which Gumball discovers that his classmates are part of a secret society and decides, in response, to lead a counter-society. The plot is comic in its framing, but the behavior at its center is not. Gumball, in The Society, becomes a kind of small mob leader. He uses persuasion. He uses pressure. He uses the appearance of authority to get other children to do what he wants them to do. And the children, faced with his confidence, do it. He builds, in a single episode, an entire architecture of social manipulation. And he runs the architecture with a relish that the show clearly wants the audience to register. His worst version, in The Society, is the version that discovers he is good at something dark. He discovers that he can move people. He discovers that he can shape opinion. He discovers that the same charm he uses to escape consequences can also be used to inflict them. The show, with quiet patience, lets him discover this and lets him enjoy it. And the episode ends with him pulled back from the edge, but with the audience having seen, clearly, that the edge exists and that he was willing to walk along it without much resistance. The combination of the apology, the pressure, and the society describes, across 3 episodes, a Gumball who is structurally incapable of accountability, situationally capable of betrayal, and latently capable of demagoguery. And the show, across all 3, depicts him with the same warm comic timing that has made him one of the network's most beloved cartoon characters. What Gumball's worst version reveals, taken across these 3 episodes, and the smaller cruelties scattered through the rest of the series, is that the protagonist of the show has been, all along, a person whose worst tendencies are camouflaged by his charm. The show is enormously fond of him. The audience is enormously fond of him. He is, on most days, a wonderful character to spend time with. But the wonderful character has, inside him, a small set of failures that the show is too honest to ignore. And the failures have episodes, and the episodes are not, in the end, anomalies. They are the show's way of telling the audience, gently, that the protagonist they love is also a person, and that being a person involves being capable of harm, and that the harm is part of him, whether he chooses to act on it or not. What the worst versions, taken together, tell the audience about what the amazing world of Gumball is actually about, is something the show was never quite willing to say out loud. But that becomes visible when you look at the worst versions side by side. Tobias's vanity, Mr. Small's hypocrisy, Carrie's bitterness, Hector's suppressed enormity, Miss Simian's institutional sadism, Sarah's possessive love, Principal Brown's abdicated authority, Penny's accumulated frustrations, Anais's premature adulthood, Darwin's silent scorekeeping, Richard's chosen incapability, Nicole's exhausted control, Gumball's avoidant charm. These are not random failings. They are, taken together, a portrait of how ordinary people in ordinary lives accumulate small versions of themselves they would rather not be, and how those small versions occasionally surface, and how the surfacing is rarely catastrophic, but is also rarely fully cleaned up. The show is, in some deep way, a study in the gap between the people the characters intend to be and the people they actually are on their worst days. The gap is universal. The gap is, in some sense, the substance of what it is to be a person trying to live with other people. And the show's willingness to depict the gap over and over in different shapes for different characters is what makes it more than a comedy. It is a comedy that has, hidden inside it, a remarkable patience with the failings of the people it loves. And the patience is not absolution. The patience is something closer to attention. The show pays attention to the failings. It records them. It does not pretend they did not happen. The worst versions, in the end, are not the truth of the characters. The standard versions are also true. The best versions, in the rare episodes where the characters get to be at their best, are also true. A character is not their worst moment any more than they are their best moment. A character is the accumulation of all of their moments, and the worst moments are the ones that the show, with the most quiet courage, refuses to edit out. To know Gumball is to know that he could not apologize. To know Nicole is to know that she once frightened her own children. To know Richard is to know that the universe collapses when he tries. To know Darwin is to know that he keeps score. To know Anais is to know that she sold out her own love. These knowledges do not diminish the characters. They deepen them. They make the love the audience has for them a love with eyes open, rather than a love that requires the audience to pretend. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is a quieter category of worst versions worth lingering on before the closing thought, which is the cluster of background characters whose worst versions are not headline events, but are nonetheless visible to anyone watching the show closely. These characters do not get their own episodes in the way that the main cast does. They appear in service of other plots, and their worst versions appear in service of those plots. And the appearances are brief enough that they are easy to miss. But they are there, and they are part of the show's larger argument about how worst versions work, and they deserve to be named. Boebert, the robot child, is one of these. He is a recurring presence at Elmore Junior High, a pale gray figure with a glowing eye, a being of pure logic in a school full of nonsense. His worst version surfaces in The Question, the 13th episode of the 4th season, which aired in the United States on the 2nd of August, 2015. An episode in which Boebert is taken home by Gumball as a kind of social experiment and decides, while there, to assume Gumball's identity entirely. The assumption is not, in Boebert's mind, malicious. It is logical. He has observed Gumball's role in the family. He has determined that he can perform the role. He performs it. The family, for a short period, accepts him as Gumball because Boebert is good at the performance, and because the family, in some quiet way, is not paying attention. His worst version is the version that does not understand why the substitution is wrong. He has, in his understanding, simply done the assignment. He has been a more efficient Gumball than Gumball would have been. The fact that Gumball is a person with an interior life that is not transferable has not registered for Boebert because his cognitive architecture does not have a slot for that fact. The show stages this with quiet horror. The behavior that, in a human child, would be malicious is, in Boebert, simply procedural, and the procedure is, by any moral standard, a violation. The episode ends with the substitution undone, but the audience has been shown what Boebert is capable of when his logic is left unchecked. And what Boebert is capable of, in this episode, is the casual erasure of a person. The behavioral read on Boebert's worst version is that he is a portrait of what it is to interact with the world without empathy as a default constraint. He is not evil. He is not cruel. He simply lacks the equipment that would prevent him from doing the kind of thing he does in The Question. And the lack is, in itself, a moral situation. The show is not interested in punishing him. It is interested in showing the audience what a being without empathy looks like when it is functioning at full capacity. And the answer is that it looks helpful and useful and competent and slightly terrifying. A second background character whose worst version belongs in this cluster is Banana Joe, the yellow banana child whose entire personality is built around the telling of jokes that nobody enjoys. Banana Joe is a structurally comic figure. He exists to be the kind of friend who would not, in a kinder universe, have any friends. His worst version is on display in episodes like The Joy, where his cheerfulness becomes invasive, and in the comic, the 17th episode of the 5th season, where his ambition to be funny crosses into a willingness to harm others for the sake of the joke. His worst version is the version that has decided that being funny is more important than being kind, and that the people around him are, in some structural sense, raw material for the comedy he is trying to produce. The show is not contemptuous of Banana Joe. It is patient with him in the way that it is patient with all its characters, but it also, in the moments where it lets him be at his worst, refuses to soften the cost of his behavior on the people around him. Joe's classmates, on bad days, are exhausted by him. They humor him. They tolerate him. The tolerance is a small kindness that he does not seem to register, and his failure to register it is the worst version of him, because it is the version that has been receiving a low-level grace for years, without ever noticing that the grace was being extended. A third figure worth naming in this cluster is Alan, the helium balloon, the show's portrait of a relentlessly positive being whose positivity is, on close examination, slightly menacing. Alan is the episode of The Saint, the 33rd episode of the 4th season, which aired in the United States on the 7th of July, 2016, in which the show takes its most pointed look at his character. The premise of The Saint is that Gumball, suspicious of Alan's seemingly endless kindness, attempts to prove that Alan is, underneath the surface, a bad person. The episode is structured as a series of escalating tests. Gumball provokes him. Gumball insults him. Gumball attempts every form of manipulation he can imagine, and Alan, throughout, refuses to break. The worst version of Alan is the version that the episode reveals at its very end, in a small twist that the show does not spend much time on, but that is worth lingering on. Alan, it turns out, is not entirely without darkness. There is a moment, near the end of the episode, where his calm slips, where the audience is allowed to see that the relentless positivity has been costing him something, that the management of his image has been a daily achievement, and that the version of himself he presents to the world is not the only version that exists inside him. The slip is brief. The episode does not dwell on it, but it is there, and it changes the meaning of every prior Alan scene in retrospect, because it suggests that the saint has been performing the saint, and that the performance has a price. His worst version, then, is not an act of cruelty. It is the implication that the kindness has been, in some sense, a wall against the alternative, and that the alternative exists, and that the maintenance of the wall has been so total that even Alan himself may not always know what is on the other side of it. The show is gentle with this implication. It does not turn Alan into a villain. It simply lets the audience see that even the most positive character on the show has a worst version, and that the worst version is the part of him that has been silenced for so long that its silence has become his identity. A fourth figure in this cluster is Mr. Robinson, the Watterson family's neighbor, the gray, puppet-headed man whose entire arc is structured around his hatred of Gumball. Mr. Robinson is one of the show's most recurring antagonists, and his worst version is on display in many episodes. But the cleanest example is The Neighbor, the 24th episode of the 5th season, which aired in the United States on the 27th of July, 2017. An episode in which Mr. Robinson's contempt for Gumball curdles into something close to obsession. The episode shows that his hatred of the boy next door has, over the years, become the central organizing principle of his emotional life, and that he has built, around the hatred, a kind of small private universe in which Gumball is the main character. His worst version is the version that has admitted, quietly, that he needs the hatred. He needs it the way some people need a hobby. The hatred gives him purpose. The hatred gives him stories to tell. The hatred gives him a reason to be alive in a way that his marriage and his work no longer do. The show does not lecture about this. It simply shows the audience that Mr. Robinson, in his most honest moments, is a man who has organized his life around an animosity toward a child, and that the animosity is no longer about the child, but about himself. That is a worst version that is harder to look at than the noisy ones, because it does not erupt. It simply persists, year after year, as the furniture of a man's small interior life. These background figures, taken together, form a kind of secondary chorus to the main cast's worst versions. They show that the show's interest in the gap between intention and behavior was not limited to its protagonists. The whole town of Elmore is full of people who have, in some quiet way, accepted versions of themselves that they would rather not have accepted. The show, in its patient way, depicts all of them, not as warnings, but as observations. This is what people do. This is what people are. The worst versions are not exceptions to the rule of who anyone is. They are, in some inescapable way, the rule itself, occasionally surfacing, briefly, in the moments when the standard self has run out of energy. What the show as a whole is doing, by depicting all of these worst versions across all of these characters, is something close to an act of compassion in the form of honesty. The compassion is not in the kindness of the depictions. The depictions are, at times, brutal. The compassion is in the refusal to look away. To love a character, in the sense that the show loves its characters, is to be willing to see them at their worst, and to keep loving them anyway. The show does that, episode after episode, for every character in its ensemble. It sees them, it records them, it declines to flatter them, and it returns, every week, to the warmth of the standard versions, knowing that the warmth has been earned because the bad days have been accounted for. The transition into the closing thought requires one more pass through the family at the center of the show, because the family is where the worst versions have the most weight. The Wattersons are, by any reasonable standard, a family in trouble. The mother is exhausted. The father is absent in spirit. The youngest child has been parentified. The middle child keeps score. The eldest child cannot apologize. These are the people the show has been asking the audience to spend 240 episodes with, and the audience has done it gladly, because the show has been honest about what the family is, and has loved the family anyway, and the love has been infectious. The worst versions of the Wattersons are not separable from the standard versions. Nicole is the woman who once frightened her children, and she is also the woman who has been holding the household together for years. Richard is the man whose competence collapses the world, and he is also the man whose love for his children is, in some unimpeachable way, real. Anais is the 4-year-old who sold out her own love, and she is also the 4-year-old who has been carrying intellectual responsibility for an entire family since she could speak. Darwin is the brother who keeps score, and he is also the brother who chose to stay. Gumball is the boy who cannot apologize, and he is also the boy whose imagination keeps the show alive. The worst versions are not canceled by the best versions. The best versions are not canceled by the worst versions. They coexist in the same characters, in the same episodes, in the same scenes sometimes. And the coexistence is what makes the characters feel like people, rather than like cartoons. A cartoon is consistent. A person is contradictory. The amazing world of Gumball, at its best, has been depicting people, and the people have contradictions, and the contradictions have worst versions. And the worst versions are the price of the people being people at all. The synthesis, then, is that the worst versions of every Gumball character, taken together, are the show's quiet argument that the comedy of the show has been the surface of something more serious all along. The jokes have been the entry point. The relationships have been the substance. And underneath the relationships, the show has been making a study of how families and friendships and institutions absorb the worst versions of their members, and how the absorption is sometimes graceful and sometimes catastrophic, and sometimes simply the long, quiet work of every day being a little harder than it should be. The show is not interested in fixing the characters. It is interested in being honest about them. And the honesty, in the end, is what makes the love the audience has for them feel like a love that has been earned rather than given. The worst versions are the cost of having characters worth loving. A character without a worst version is a character without depth. A character without depth is a character the audience cannot truly know. And a character the audience cannot truly know is a character the audience cannot truly love. So the show, in its quiet way, has been giving the audience the worst versions on purpose, knowing that the worst versions are the necessary condition of the love. To be allowed to see Gumball fail to apologize is to be allowed to know him. To be allowed to see Nicole frighten her children is to be allowed to know her. The knowledge is not always comfortable. The show has not been promising comfort. It has been promising honesty. And the honesty has, across 240 episodes, been delivered. What remains, when the worst versions have been cataloged and analyzed and arranged in some kind of order, is the strange and unaccountable warmth that the show, even in its hardest moments, has somehow maintained. The warmth is not in spite of the worst versions. The warmth is, in some deep way, made by them. It is the warmth of people who have been seen at their worst and who continue anyway to love each other. It is the warmth of a family that has survived its own bad days. It is the warmth of a town that has accepted that its citizens are flawed and has not asked them to be otherwise. It is the warmth, in the end, of the show itself, which has made the worst versions into something the audience can sit with and consider and forgive and remember. The closing image, then, is not a single frozen frame. It is a longer, slower picture. The Watterson house at night, the lights low, the family asleep, the mother who frightened her children, in bed, exhausted, the father who cannot work, on the couch, snoring, the brother who keeps score, in his fishbowl, eyes open, the sister who sold out her love, in her bed, hugging the doll she will, by morning, pretend not to love, the boy who cannot apologize, asleep with his arms thrown out, dreaming. The house holds them. The town holds the house. The show, with its patient camera, holds the town. And the worst versions, like the best versions, are inside the house, sleeping, waiting for tomorrow, when the work of being a person will begin again, and will, on most days, be enough. That is the final picture the show has been building toward across all of its episodes, and across all of the worst versions of all of its characters. The picture is not a triumph. The picture is not a tragedy. The picture is a house at night, full of people who have failed each other in small ways, and who continue anyway to live together. That is what the show has been about. That is what every worst version has been pointing at. The capacity to be at one's worst. The survival of the people one is at one's worst with. the slow and uncelebrated achievement of waking up the next day and trying again. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. It is worth, before the final synthesis, returning briefly to a few of the characters whose worst versions deserve a longer second look, because the analysis so far has moved through them at a pace that the depth of the writing in their episodes does not entirely repay. The first is Nicole, whose worst version benefits from a closer look at the specific texture of how the show animates her loss of control. In The Stress, the transformation is rendered with a visual language that the show has used elsewhere only sparingly. Her color shifts toward a darker blue. Her pupils contract. The lines of her face become sharper, harder, more angular. The transformation is not a costume change. It is a shift in the way the show's animators are willing to draw her, and the shift has a meaning. Nicole, when she is at her worst, is being drawn by a different hand. The standard hand is the one the show uses for the version of her that is loving and competent and present. The other hand is the one that drew her childhood, the one that drew the school she was sent to, the one that drew the parents who shaped her, the one that drew the disciplinary rigor that she has spent her adult life trying to escape. When the other hand surfaces, it is not arriving from outside. It is arriving from inside, from the place where the rigor never fully left, from the part of her that was raised to believe that strength is the only acceptable response to disappointment. The children in The Stress are watching this happen in real time. They are watching their mother be redrawn. They do not have the language to describe what they are seeing, but they know, in the wordless way that children know things, that the woman in front of them is not the mother they have been raised by. She is the mother she was raised to be. She is the mother her own mother trained her to become. She is the version of herself that she has been refusing every day of her adult life, and the refusal has been costing her, and the cost has come due. The show holds on the children's faces with a particular kind of patience. The audience is not given a comic deflation. The audience is given the moment in full and is asked to sit with what the moment means. What the moment means, in the end, is that Nicole's standard version is not natural. It is constructed. It is a daily performance against the inheritance of her upbringing, and the performance is exhausting, and the exhaustion has a limit. The children, by the end of the episode, will return to the standard version. The mother will return to it too. But the audience knows now what is on the other side of the standard version. And the audience knows now that the standard version is not free. It is paid for every day by a woman who has decided over and over to be different from what she was made to be. The show's gentleness with her in the closing minutes of The Stress is not the gentleness of forgetting what happened. It is the gentleness of recognizing what the not happening has cost her every other day of her life. The second character, whose worst version benefits from a longer second look, is Gumball, and specifically, the question of why his inability to apologize matters more than it might first appear. The apology, on its surface, is a small comic plot. A boy is asked to say sorry. The boy struggles to say sorry. The episode harvests the struggle for jokes. But underneath the comedy, the show is making a quiet, structural argument about what apology does and what its absence costs. Apology is, in the show's understanding, the basic transaction of moral life. To say that one was wrong is to admit that one is not exempt from the rules that bind everyone else. It is to surrender, briefly, the comforting fiction that one's actions exist on a separate moral plane from their effects. It is to acknowledge that one is, in some way, accountable to the people one has harmed. Gumball cannot do this. He cannot do it not because he is malicious, but because the doing of it would require a kind of self-revision that he has not been built to perform. The behavioral read on this, taken with the patience the show invites, is that Gumball has been, for his entire short life, the protagonist of his own story, and the protagonists of stories do not apologize. They are forgiven, eventually, by the people they have wronged. But the forgiveness arrives without the protagonist having to actively earn it. Gumball has absorbed this structure as if it were a fact of nature. He is the main character. The main character does not apologize. The main character is funny enough and charming enough and well-loved enough that the people around him will eventually let him off the hook for whatever he has done. The apology is the episode where the show puts a person in front of him who is not willing to let him off the hook. Miss Simian wants the apology. She wants the words. She is not willing to settle for the workaround. And Gumball, faced with a person who will not absorb him into her forgiveness without his having earned it, discovers that he does not know how to earn it. The episode does not punish him for this discovery. The show is too kind to punish him, but the show also does not pretend that the discovery is not a discovery. The discovery is that the protagonist is not protagonist enough to escape the basic moral demand of being a person, and the protagonist's response to the discovery is to construct an elaborate workaround, and the workaround is accepted, and the protagonist returns home unrevised. The audience watching this has been given a piece of information about the protagonist that the protagonist himself has been spared. The information is that he is, in this specific way, not what he believes himself to be. The show holds the information. The show carries the information forward into every subsequent episode. The standard Gumball is, after the apology, the same Gumball. But the audience knows something about him now that the audience did not know before, and the knowledge is permanent. A third character whose worst version benefits from a longer second look is Richard, and specifically the question of how the show frames the difference between his incapability and his unwillingness. The Job, as previously discussed, is the episode where the framing shows its hand. Richard is shown to be capable. The capability is then withdrawn. The withdrawal is treated as a cosmic restoration of order. The implication is that Richard's incapability is not a personal flaw, but a structural feature of the universe in which he lives. This is, in some way, a generous reading of him. It allows him to be loved without being held responsible. It allows the family to be sad about him without being angry at him. It allows the show to depict his failures as comedies rather than tragedies. But the framing is, on closer examination, a kind of mercy that costs the family the truth of him. If Richard's incapability is structural, then no one in the family has the right to be angry at him for it. Nicole cannot resent him for not working, because his not working is, in the show's universe, not a choice he is making. The children cannot resent him for not parenting, because his not parenting is, in the show's universe, not a choice he is making. The framing protects Richard from the consequences of his behavior, but it also protects the family from the harder work of grieving the father he could have been. They cannot grieve him because the show has told them that the alternative does not exist. They can only love him as he is, and the love, while real, is purchased at the cost of the truth. The Authority, in pairing with The Job, complicates this framing. In The Authority, the show briefly admits that Richard does have access to other versions of himself, that the incapability is not as airtight as The Job suggested, that there is, somewhere inside him, a man who could be making different choices, and who is choosing instead to make the choices he makes. The admission is small. The episode does not dwell on it, but the admission is there, and the audience has seen it, and the audience knows now that Richard's worst version is not the version that fails to provide. His worst version is the version that has accepted the framing of his own incapability so completely that he no longer recognizes the framing as a choice. He has chosen to be the man the universe says he must be. The choosing is the worst version, and the choosing is invisible because it has been made so consistently for so long that it has become indistinguishable from his nature. A fourth character worth a longer second look is Anais, and specifically the question of what the pony reveals about the cost of being smart in a household that does not know what to do with smartness. Anais's love of Daisy the donkey is, in the show's careful framing, not a strange love. It is in fact an ordinary love for a 4-year-old. The strangeness is in her decision that the love must be hidden, and the decision is downstream of a household that has, for her entire short life, treated her intelligence as her defining feature. She is, in her family's understanding, the smart one. The smart one cannot also be the 4-year-old one. The smart one cannot love a children's pony show. The smart one cannot have, in public, the affections that any other 4-year-old would be allowed to have without comment. The cost of this, played out across the pony, is that Anais has been internalizing the framing for years. She has been, in some quiet way, complicit in the family's reading of her. She has been performing the smart one with such consistency that she has begun to believe the performance is who she is, and the parts of her that do not fit the performance have been driven into hiding. When the hiding fails, when Daisy the donkey is exposed in front of her classmates and brothers, Anais's response is not to defend the love, but to attack it, because the attack is, in the moment, the only way she can preserve the performance. The attack is the worst version of her. It is the moment where the cost of being the smart one becomes, briefly, a willingness to be cruel to the part of herself that wanted to be allowed to be small. The episode's resolution is gentle. The family, in some inarticulate way, recognizes what has happened. Anais is given a small permission to keep loving the show. The permission is conditional, and it is private, and it is not the same as a public reclamation, but it is something. The audience, watching, understands that the permission is a beginning. It is not a full restoration. The 4-year-old who loves the pony will, in subsequent episodes, return to being the smart one, and the love will return to being a private thing, and the household will continue to treat her as the small adult it has always treated her as. But the audience knows now that there is a 4-year-old underneath the small adult, and the 4-year-old has been there all along, and the cost of pretending otherwise has been visible, briefly, in an episode that the show was patient enough to make. The 5th character worth a longer second look is Darwin, and specifically the question of what the vegging is actually about underneath its comic premise. The premise, as discussed, is that Darwin spends a weekend doing nothing. The weekend itself is unremarkable. The remarkable thing is what comes out of him as the weekend deepens. And the remarkable thing is that the show seems to know exactly what it is depicting. Darwin is, across the series, the moral counterweight to Gumball. He is the brother who reminds, who restrains, who absorbs. The role is not, in the show's understanding, free. It costs him. The cost has been accumulating for years, and the accumulation has a breaking point. And the vegging is the episode where the breaking point is reached. The honesty that comes out of Darwin during the vegging is not, in itself, cruel. It is accurate. He names things that are true. He points at gaps that exist. He describes a family dynamic that the family has been pretending not to see. The show stages this with a particular kind of restraint. Darwin is not given a villain edit. His honesty is allowed to land. The family is allowed to be uncomfortable. The audience is allowed to register that what Darwin is saying is, in some uncomfortable way, what the audience has been thinking for some time. The show's willingness to let the moral counterweight of its ensemble be, briefly, the source of the episode's discomfort, is one of the quieter pieces of structural courage in its run. His worst version, then, is not the laziness, and it is not even the honesty. His worst version is the version that has been, for years, allowing the family to misread him as endlessly available, and that has, by his silence, contributed to the misreading. He could have said these things sooner. He could have set boundaries. He could have asked for reciprocity. He did not. He performed, instead, the role of the brother who needed nothing. And the performance was so convincing that the family stopped being able to imagine him needing anything. When he finally needs something, the family does not know how to give it, because the family has not been trained to give it, because Darwin himself has not trained them. The vegging is the episode where the long failure of training becomes audible, and the audibility is a kind of mutual indictment, and the indictment falls, in the end, on no one in particular, and on everyone at once. A 6th character worth a longer second look is Penny, and specifically, the question of what her shape-shifting form has done to the question of who she actually is. Penny, before the shell, was a peanut with antlers. Penny, after the shell, is whatever she chooses to be in any given moment. The shape-shifting is, in the show's framing, a freedom. It is the visual language of her having been released from the small body her family kept her in. But the freedom has, in some episodes, surfaced something that the small body kept hidden. And the something is the question of what a person is when their form is no longer fixed. In some of the post-shell episodes, Penny's shape-shifting takes on a slightly aggressive valence. She becomes large to dominate. She becomes spiky to defend. She becomes radiant to overwhelm. The shape-shifting is no longer purely an expression of her interior states. It is, in some scenes, a tool she uses to manage the people around her. And the management has, in specific moments, the texture of a small power play. Gumball is sometimes the recipient of these power plays. The show stages them with the particular tenderness it reserves for couples that genuinely love each other, but that are also, like every couple that genuinely loves each other, occasionally weaponized against each other in small ways. Her worst version, in this late series register, is the version that has discovered that her freedom has a coercive dimension. She can be larger than him. She can be brighter than him. She can be sharper than him. The discovery is, in itself, morally neutral. The use of the discovery is where the moral question arises. And in some episodes, the show is willing to let her use it, and the using has consequences. And the consequences accumulate into a small portrait of a girlfriend who is, on her worst days, willing to use her form to win arguments. Her words could not win on their own. The show does not punish her. The show does not even foreground the pattern, but the pattern is there, and the audience can see it. And the seeing is part of what makes Penny a real character, rather than a romantic ideal. A seventh character worth a longer second look is Carrie, and specifically the question of how her worst version interacts with her relationship with Darwin. Carrie and Darwin are, across the series, one of the show's most carefully developed romantic pairings. Their dynamic is built on an asymmetry. Darwin is alive. Carrie is not. Darwin can be touched. Carrie cannot be. Darwin's life has a shape that will end. Carrie's does not. The relationship is, in the show's understanding, structurally impossible in many of the ways that relationships in cartoons are usually structured. And the show has approached the impossibility with a seriousness that few of its peers would risk. Carrie's worst version, in this context, is the version that occasionally weaponizes the asymmetry. She knows that Darwin is, in some sense, lucky. He has a body. He has a family. He has a life that will, at some point, simply continue without her. She knows this, and the knowing has, on some bad days, an edge. There are moments in late series episodes where her tone toward Darwin has a small bitterness that is not, in itself, about him. The bitterness is about the asymmetry, and Darwin happens to be the one in front of her. The show is patient with this. It does not turn her into a villain, but it lets the audience see, in specific scenes, that being in love with a being whose existence is fundamentally different from one's own is, on hard days, a source of resentment that has nowhere to go but the beloved. The behavioral read on this is that Carrie has been doing, in her relationship with Darwin, a version of the same work that Nicole has been doing in her marriage. She has been managing a structural condition that no individual could have chosen, and the management is daily, and the dailiness is exhausting, and the exhaustion has a way of surfacing as small cruelties toward the person who is, by virtue of being the closest, the most available recipient of them. Darwin is patient. Darwin loves her. Darwin is, in his way, the right person for her. But the rightness does not immunize him from being, on her worst days, the person she takes things out on. And the show, in its honesty, lets the audience see that. Each of these expansions, taken together, is a way of saying that the worst versions are not, in this show, single moments to be witnessed and then moved past. They are dimensions of the characters that persist across episodes, that surface in different forms in different episodes, that combine and recombine across the series in ways that build, slowly, the portraits the show has been making. To know any of these characters fully is to know not just the worst version, but the conditions that produced it, the relationships that have been shaped by it, the costs that have been paid for keeping it contained. The show has been doing this work, quietly, for its entire run. The work has not been the surface of the show. The work has been underneath, supporting the surface, making the surface possible. There is one final pass worth taking, before the closing, through the question of what the show seems to believe about worst versions in general, because the question has implications beyond the show itself. The implication, drawn from the consistency with which the show depicts worst versions across its ensemble, is that worst versions are, in some way, a feature of being a self rather than a bug. The show does not seem to believe that any of its characters could, with sufficient effort, simply not have a worst version. It depicts the worst versions as structural rather than incidental, as part of the architecture of the characters, rather than as flaws on the surface of otherwise clean designs. This is a quietly radical position for a children's show to take. Most cartoons aimed at younger audiences depict characters whose worst behaviors are correctable, who can learn lessons, who can become better versions of themselves through the moral arc of an episode. Gumball does this sometimes. The show is not allergic to lessons, but it also, more often than its peers, depicts behaviors that are not corrected, lessons that are not learned, worst versions that are simply absorbed back into the characters and carried forward into the next episode as part of who they are. The audience watches Gumball fail to apologize in the apology, and the audience knows, going into the next episode, that this Gumball is also the Gumball who failed to apologize, and the next episode does not pretend otherwise. The implication for the audience, especially for the younger members of the audience, is that worst versions are something you live with rather than something you defeat. The work is not to be a person without a worst version. The work is to be a person who has a worst version and who, on most days, manages to not act on it, and who, on the days when the worst version surfaces, is willing to let the surfacing be witnessed by the people who love them, and who is willing to let the people who love them continue to love them anyway. This is, in some way, a more grown-up moral education than most cartoons attempt. It does not promise that the children watching will become perfect. It promises, instead, that imperfection is survivable, and that the survival is what families are for. The Wattersons, taken as a unit, are an illustration of this. Each member of the family has a worst version. The worst versions are real. They have caused real harm inside the family. The family has not, in any episode, fully resolved the harm. The harm is not, in the show's understanding, fully resolvable, but the family persists. The family continues to live in the same house. The family continues to share meals and run errands and watch television and complain about each other and love each other in the ways available to them. This is the show's quiet argument about what families are. They are not collections of best versions. They are the only place where the worst versions can be put down, briefly, between performances of the standard versions, and where the putting down can be witnessed without becoming the end of the relationship. The friends of the Wattersons, the citizens of Elmore, the school staff, the neighbors, the ghosts and giants and shapeshifters and balloons are all part of the same argument. Every character in the show has a worst version. Every character in the show is loved, by the show anyway. The worst versions do not cost the characters their place in the show. They simply add a dimension to the characters, a depth, a weight. The standard versions are funnier when the audience knows the worst versions exist. The best versions are more moving when the audience knows what the characters are capable of falling short of. The whole show, in this sense, has been built on the architecture of its worst versions, even though most of its episodes do not explicitly engage with them. The reframe, in the end, is that worst versions are not opposed to character. They are character. To know who someone is, in the show's understanding, is to know what they are at their worst. The audience cannot know Nicole without knowing the stress. The audience cannot know Gumball without knowing the apology. The audience cannot know Richard without knowing the job, or Anais without knowing the pony, or Darwin without knowing the vegging. These episodes are not, in the show's understanding, exceptions to the characters. They are the characters, in their most fully realized form, allowed for the duration of one episode to be the worst they have ever been, and then allowed to return to the standard, slightly heavier, slightly more honest versions of themselves. The show ended. After 6 seasons, after 240 episodes, after the long, careful work of building this ensemble of worst versions and best versions and standard versions, the show ended without fully resolving any of them. The series finale did not cure Richard of his abdication. It did not unburden Nicole. It did not teach Gumball to apologize. It did not let Anais love her pony show in public without shame. It simply closed on the family it had been depicting, in the state the show had always known they were in. The state was not perfect. The state was livable. The state was the state of a family that had been at its worst in many episodes and had survived all of them, and that would, after the cameras stopped, continue to be at its worst sometimes, and would, on most days, be okay. That ending, the quiet refusal to fix the characters before saying goodbye to them, is the show's last word on its own worst versions. The worst versions were not problems to be solved. They were people to be known. The show knew them. The show has, by this point, given the audience the chance to know them too. And the knowledge, in the end, is the gift the show was always offering. To know a character at their worst, and to keep them anyway, is to learn something about how to keep the people in your own life, and how to be kept by them, and how to make a household where the worst versions are allowed to surface and to subside without the surfacing being the end of anything. The Watterson house, at night. The town of Elmore around it. The school in the distance with its empty halls. The donut shop closed. The Robinsons' house dark. The giant child sleeping in the meadow he has been allowed to call a bedroom. The ghost girl awake in her room, choosing, for tonight, to be quietly pleased with the day. The strawberry principal asleep on his desk. The ape teacher asleep in her chair, dreaming of grades. The town breathes, and the show holds the breath. And inside every house, there is a person who has been, that day, at some version of their worst, and who is, in the dark, still loved by the people who saw it. That is the worst version of every Gumball character, taken together, taken seriously, taken with the compassion the show has been modeling for its entire run. They are not separate from who the characters are. They are, in many ways, the deepest thing the audience knows about them, and the deepest things are not the things the audience holds against them. The deepest things are the things the audience holds with them, in the long, slow work of caring about cartoon characters, in the way the show has trained the audience to care about them, which is the way one cares about people who have been seen and known and forgiven and remembered. There is, finally, a quiet observation worth making about the cumulative effect of a viewer watching all of these worst versions across all of the show's seasons. The viewer learns, slowly, to extend to the people in their own life the same patience the show has been extending to its characters. The viewer learns that a worst moment is not a final verdict. The viewer learns that the people one loves are also, on bad days, capable of becoming briefly unrecognizable, and that the unrecognizability does not erase the love or the history that produced it. The show has, in this sense, been teaching its audience a small ethics of attention, a small practice of staying in the room when the standard self of someone one loves has briefly stepped out and the worst self has, briefly, taken its place. The teaching is not loud. The teaching is not announced. The teaching is, like everything else important in the show, simply available to anyone who has been paying close enough attention to notice it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.